Hello there, I'm Tom Goreau of the Soil Carbon Alliance, and I'm going to speak today about why the Paris Agreement failed and how to fix it. So the key points I want to make is that the Paris Agreement has had a lot of hoopla. I was one of the people who was there. I spoke inside the government area on some of the scientific data indicating the situation was far worse than was indicated. And in the end, they came up with a least common denominator agreement that essentially was so watered down that it cannot possibly live up to its own goals. So the fundamental flaws with that agreement is that while it admits that global warming could be a problem, and while it says that we should try to limit global warming to 2 degrees C, and if possible 1.5, they give no roadmap or solutions to how to get there. And the commitments that are made in terms of emissions reductions that are included in the commitments governments have made are totally inadequate to reach that goal. So what's left is essentially a claim that somehow in about a generation from now, somebody will come up with something, a magic wand or a faith-healing solution that will solve the problem and things will work out somehow. But in fact, they don't offer any sort of solution, and therefore there's no roadmap of how to get there to that solution. So they can't achieve their goals, in fact, without including soil carbon in the treaty, but that didn't happen. For 10 magical days in Paris, it seemed that a real solution would be included in the treaty. I mean, it actually seemed for the first time in 25 years of negotiations that a real solution would be offered, because on December 1st, the opening day of the conference, the French government, the hosts of the meeting, proposed the 4 per 1,000 proposal, which was to increase soil carbon contents by 0.4% per year in order to suck down the increase of CO2 and level it off. It was not a treaty to remove the dangerous excess that's needed, but it was a treaty to try to control the current buildup, and it offered the possibility of a real solution. And they asked governments to sign on to that. Some 25 governments did sign on to it, and they were all European countries or rich countries like Japan and Australia, and only 2 developing countries, Costa Rica and Mexico, signed on. Now, the French proposed this on December 1st, and what happened is they didn't pursue it. It went nowhere, and on December 10th, when the French government then offered a compromise watered-down treaty, slashing out half of the documents that were in front of them to have something simple enough they could get people to agree with, they abandoned their own soil proposal on December 10th. So for 10 days, it seemed that something would happen. In fact, it really energized a lot of the NGO groups that were there, in particular the agricultural groups, the organic farmers, et cetera, et cetera. People were really expecting that for the first time, soil carbon would be on the agenda, that restorative agriculture that puts carbon back in the soil would be on the agenda. Restorative livestock management that restores the carbon in the soil would be on the agenda. That all the positive solutions that we know exist there that need to be implemented urgently to draw down CO2, that could have been in that treaty, and it was simply abandoned. It was left out. So we have a treaty that misses the solution entirely, and it's really crucial now at this point to pursue it to make that treaty stronger. Because the fact is that like the original treaty, which was signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the protocols, that is to say the details of how to achieve that hasn't been written. The protocols for Rio were the Kyoto protocols, and the Kyoto meeting wasn't until 1997. It took them 5 years after Rio to get around to writing up some sort of a goal of what people should actually do to live up to that treaty. And the Kyoto Protocol, as we all know, was too weak and totally failed to meet their own goal. Paris repeats the same errors as the Kyoto Protocol by trying to bring everything to everybody. So while you can say that there's an admission that climate change is a problem, and while there's actually an admission that countries like small island states that are being flooded by sea level rise, that have been losses and damages caused by climate change. That's admitted for the first time, but there is no mechanism for losses or damages to be for restitution for those things. There's no mechanism for liability. there's no mechanism for funding to make what people have lost. So it's a treaty that doesn't really meet any goals. Now, so here's the question. How could we make it an effective treaty? Now, a lot of other people have criticized, and I will come back to their criticism in a minute, but first let me show you the first book published about the Paris Agreement, which came out a week later by my friend Albert Bates. Albert's a really remarkable person, I've got to say. He's a permaculture expert. He grows trees, especially fruit trees, with the Maya Indians in Yucatan. He does it in lots of other places around the world. He teaches training workshops with indigenous communities using biochar and rock powder and other things in organic farming. So he's quite a guy. And he's written a whole bunch of books, including a great book on biochar. So he was there, and he was, besides myself, the only person on the side of the blue zone in Paris, that is where government delegates were, to say that biochar and organic carbon in soil should be a part of the solution to draw down CO2 before dangerous warming occurred. He and I were the only people saying that, but that message was lost, didn't fall through. So Albert has a book which I recommend highly, The Paris Agreement, the best chance we have to save the one planet we've got. And if you look closely, and you can't probably see that here, it says here, the soil story in the lights on the Eiffel Tower. You probably can't say. Anyway, this is a great book by Albert Bates. It comes highly recommended. And what's really useful about it is it's actually his personal story about the whole conference. And so it's sort of a log of the events leading up to the Paris Agreement, and then during the meeting itself, day by day, what happened from one person's point of view. There were 40,000 people there at that meeting. Each one of them could have told the story from a totally different point of view, because each one is in a different sub-world at this meeting, and this is Albert's story of it, and I do recommend it highly. But what is especially useful for it, because Albert's a smart guy and he knows a lot, he was in fact at one point a lawyer who argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court before he became a farmer. So he's a very interesting fellow. But right at the end of the book, and I won't scroll through that, is the entire agreement itself, where anyone can read it. And reading it is an illustrative point, because soils are not mentioned, farming is not mentioned, livestock are not mentioned. Forests are mentioned only insofar as people can get credits for planting trees or preventing forests from being cut down. So there's a carbon credit opportunity recognized for trees, so trees are recognized. Oceans are mentioned in passing in one place. 80% of the Earth's surface are mentioned in one place in passing, a phrase saying environmental damage to land and oceans or something like that. Indigenous people are mentioned by the way as well. There's a lot of things that are just kind of thrown in, but in fact, when you read the document, you realize that 90% of it was written by lawyers to avoid financial liability. That's the purpose of the treaty. The treaty is not a treaty to analyze the global climate change problem and solve it. It's not that at all. It's a way to avoid having to pay for whatever people come up with. And there's an interesting that when I got back from Paris and looked at the BBC website and there was an interview with President Obama about the meeting, and President Obama who said to the BBC, this treaty will not solve the problem. That's absolutely right. It is totally inadequate to solve the problem. And I do recommend that anyone who doubts that read the treaty for themselves to see what kind of vague and wishy-washy language there is there. Now, the fact is, in reality, it's going to be several years before the protocols are written, and that's where it has to be given teeth if it's going to work. What we have there can't work. So one of the reasons it can't work is that 2 degrees is not acceptable. One of the goals of the treaty is to protect Earth's ecosystems. But in fact, coral reefs, which are the most temperature-sensitive ecosystem, can't be protected. This is a very recently published paper, and it shows temperature increases, temperature change versus the fraction of the impact realized. The blue line here is coral reefs. At 1 degree C, the coral reefs are beginning to seriously disappear. By 2, they're gone. So 2 degrees is not acceptable level of warming for coral reefs at all. It's that simple. Coral reefs are the most sensitive ecosystem. 1.5 is not enough. That means losing more than 90% of them, according to this data here in this paper. It's something that I've said for 25 years because I was the person who developed the method for predicting coral bleaching 25 years ago. And in fact, at that point, I showed that 1 degree warming was the limit for coral reefs. And we've known for 25 years that coral reefs couldn't take any more warming than 1 degree, that was their limit. And governments have simply let our coral reefs die. And they've mostly died in the last 20 years, 25 years since we knew what the problem was. So, at any rate, but this latest scientific data indicates it's really serious. So if we want to solve the problem, we've got to put CO2 into the soil just as fast as we can. Now that solution's missing from this treaty. And I do want to say a couple things about people who are very aware of the issues here. And I'm going to say other people who have criticized the treaty. And the one I want to focus on first is James Hansen. James Hansen was at a press conference with Albert Bates, the fellow who wrote the book there. In fact, he mentions it in the book in a chapter there, being at the press conference with James Hansen. And that was not in the blue zone where diplomats were. This was out in the public area where the public could be. So he wasn't addressing the decision makers at all. But anyway, Hansen, and this was written just before. This was dated December 27th, and I have to look at it. But the key point, and Hansen immediately denounced in that press conference, you have to look at Albert Bates' book to see it, he denounced it as a fraud and a farce, the treaty. Now, and his take is very interesting because what he's discussing here is what is being proposed. And the reason he's opposed to it is there's no mechanism to remove the dangerous CO2. Hansen is not a supporter of the soil carbon solution. He recognizes that emissions reductions are not enough, and he doesn't really quite know what to do. But what he knows is that what's in this treaty cannot possibly do it. And part of the thing is that he's got a long presentation here, but to cut to the point here, he refers to what's called, and in his discussion in Paris, he discussed what he's called a fake solution that he believes is the one that the government is listening to, the Obama administration, the Department of Agriculture. He calls Big Green. And he says that it's guaranteed to have a fake and bad agreement, that people are trying to mislead it. And so one thing they did not do in Paris is they refused to discuss putting a price on carbon. Okay? And that was from the US point of view. So they've flat out rejected carbon, any kind of carbon pricing, and that's why soils were eliminated, because people they did not want to have to pay for putting the carbon in the soils. But what he points out is that there was a group, what he refers to here as Big Green. And Big Green, he says, is a group that's influencing the governments and influence the whole agenda that was set by the Paris Agreement. Okay? And this is why he's opposed to the Paris Agreement. Let me quote his words here. Big Green, I'm quoting James Hansen here, Big Green consists of several, quote, environmental, unquote, organizations, including Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, and Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, each with $100 million plus budgets, each springing from high-minded useful beginnings, each with more high-priced lawyers than you can shake a stick at. EDF, with pure-blind equation of the sulfur and carbon pollution problems, was our chief architect of the disastrous Kyoto Lemon. NRDC proudly claims credit for Obama's EPA strategy and foolishly allows it to migrate to Paris. But what he's saying is that the only solution is to avoid Big Green entirely, because what Big Green has proposed, and we should explain who Big Green is also the agricultural business, Big Ag, the agrochemical industry. And what they're proposing, and the next critic will explain it in more detail, is they're proposing a solution to pump CO2 into the ground that doesn't exist now, technically, and would not be affordable if it did, and would have huge side effects if it were ever to be done, including triggering earthquakes all the time from pumping CO2 into the ground if it's done on the scale they need. But Big Green is basically proposing, I'll come to that in a second, they're proposing essentially to grow trees on an industrial scale to burn in huge power plants, separate the CO2 from the exhaust, and then pump that underground, triggering earthquakes, et cetera, et cetera. That's their goal in order to get the carbon credits. So they're ready for when there is a carbon price, and they have an industrial solution that could only be implemented on a large scale. That's what's called Big Green. And what Hansen is basically saying is, this can't work. The technology doesn't work. They simply can't pump the stuff into the ground effectively or at a cost that's affordable. So he's opposed to that. And so what he says here, and Hansen's point here, is that Obama still has a chance at a positive climate legacy if he ditches Big Green. And then what he says is, in the end here, watch what happens in Paris carefully to see if all the leaders do is sign off on the PAP that UN bureaucrats are putting together, indulgences and promises to reduce future emissions, and then clap each other on the back and declare success. In that case, President Obama will have sold our children and theirs down the river. And that's James Hansen's comment on the treaty, and that's what he says. So that's his point of view, because he believes the treaty can't achieve its goals. So he's very visceral. But let me take another point of view here, because this is another very famous climate scientist, another one who I highly respect. And this is the work of Kevin Anderson, who is the director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research in the United Kingdom, one of the world's top climate scientists. And he was also there in Paris. And this is his comment on the Paris. This is the latest issue of Nature, which came out, got it when I arrived back from Paris, okay? And what he says here, the title is, and it's basically an editorial review in the world's most prestigious scientific magazine, talks in the City of Light generate more heat, i.e. not light. Rather than relying on far-off negative emissions technologies, Paris needed to deliver a low-carbon roadmap for today. That's the heading. Now, the key point here is, and what really alarms Kevin Anderson and why he rails against the treaty as being a fraud, as a fantasy, as it says, because he believes, again, that they can't possibly meet the goals that they claim. Now, neither Hansen or Anderson are proponents of the soil carbon solution, so let me make this clear, that they just know what's being proposed can't work. And what particularly alarms Anderson here is that governments, prompted by their advisors, have plumped for BECCS, biomass energy carbon capture and storage, as the most promising negative emissions technology. And that is the Big Green strategy, okay, the so-called BECCS strategy. And what does BECCS entail? Apportioning huge swathes of the planet's landmass to the growing of bioenergy crops, from big trees to tall grasses, in other words, genetically engineered single species, which absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis as they grow. Periodically, these crops are harvested, processed for worldwide travel, and shipped around the globe before finally being combusted in thermal power stations. These are shipped biomass to other places in central stations. The CO2 is then stripped from the waste gases, compressed almost to a liquid, pumped through large pipes over potentially very long distances, and finally stored deep underground in various geological formations from exhausted oil and gas reservoirs through saline aquifers for a millennium or two. He doesn't say that will trigger earthquakes everywhere where that happens. He's not a geophysicist. I learned geophysics at MIT and Caltech, so I know that will happen, but that's not his background. He's a climate scientist, not a geophysicist. But anyhow, he sees that this is an impossible situation, but that was the solution that is being proposed by many governments that even they dropped at the last point. So it's an important point. And what Anderson says here, and I say this is the director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, one of the world's most prestigious academic climate research institutions, he ends by saying, it is pantomime season, and the world has just gambled its future on the appearance in a puff of smoke of a carbon-sucking fairy godmother. The Paris Agreement is a roadmap to a better future? Oh no, it's not. Now, I agree with James Hansen and Kevin Anderson that the Paris Agreement is an agreement that cannot achieve its own goals. It lacks a mechanism, it lacks a solution. And unfortunately, neither Hansen nor Anderson recognize that, in fact, a solution is in hand and was offered there, which is the green solution that we propose, the down-to-earth solution of putting the carbon in the ground through plant growth, increasing soil carbon as organic carbon and as biochar, which will retain water, cool the earth through transpiration, restore water supplies, and produce far more food, and it was a restoration solution, that was completely missing. Now, at the same time, we're being offered as an alternative to restoration, which was not mentioned anywhere in the treaty. The key point is that without global scale restoration, we can't solve the problem. We've had, however, a fake solution that I want to identify here. And part of the lessons I want to learn here from Paris is that the real solutions were ignored in favor of frauds. We've got to correct that. Big green versus what I call big brown, bottom up versus top down, geotherapy versus geoengineering, restoration versus degradation. These are the themes I want to discuss here. Now, the point is the Paris Agreement can't work unless they include soils. Big Ag was there. And as I mentioned in Hansen and Anderson's presentation, they proposed what's called BECS. It's a very cunning, fraudulent solution that was backed by some of the biggest companies in the world. They're backed by people like Bill Gates, they're backed by Richard Branson, they're backed by very big money, and they also had a press conference at the very opening of the Paris meeting to say, we have the solution, give us the money, and we'll just plant a lot of trees and pump CO2 into the ground. And they had this, and big governments, including the US, were backing them. That's why soils didn't get in, because it was a threat to this group. So they're there. Big Ag is organized and ready, and they were very well organized, much better than we were. And but no, the point is that BECS is biomass-enhanced carbon capture and sequestration, and as pointed out by Anderson, this means genetic engineered chemical spray, fertilized trees to be burned for energy, transported long distances, burned for energy in large plants. The CO2 is sort of frozen out. It's only a few percent of the exhaust gases concentrated out from all the nitrogen and oxygen, concentrated to liquids, pumped maybe thousands of miles and then pumped underground at some other place where it will only cause problems. So that's that they're calling big green. And we must say this is not green at all. This is not green at all. This is a way to continue fossil fuel emissions and to hide the problem and not to solve it. And we object to it very greatly because it's a danger, because the false solution is promoting itself as being green when it's not green at all, and it's therefore preventing a true green solution from being recognized. And it's a very dangerous situation. It has to be dealt with and understood. So big green is a fake. It's a pseudo-green solution. It should never be confused for the real thing. And we want to distinguish it. It's a geoengineering solution, not a geotherapy solution. By a geoengineering solution, what I mean is they see CO2 as a waste product to be hidden and gotten rid of. They want to pump the CO2 underground. They want to hide the problem. They want to prevent recycling of that carbon within the biological system. They want to do so in a way that will reduce biodiversity, that will compete with food production, because it will take land into tree plantations for burning. It will degrade soil, carbon, and ecosystems, because it's the same old chemical model of mass agriculture that runs down carbon in soils. It will drain the water supplies as they pump water into it. It's a top-down solution which will make Big Ag richer, because they're the ones who will get the profits. It's extremely expensive and unproven, because the technology doesn't even exist, and would cause earthquakes. That's geoengineering. And that's not green at all. That's what we call a brown solution. The green solution is what we call geotherapy, which is restoring the natural mechanisms that maintain the Earth's planetary life support systems and the quality of our air, our water, and our soils and our oceans. And geotherapy is large-scale restoration. It means increasing biomass and increasing soil carbon, which can easily be done in decades. It means recycling that carbon through more growth, seeing that CO2 as a feedstock and a resource to grow more and grow more growth to make the land more productive, increase biodiversity, and increase food security at the same time. It's very different than the geoengineering approach. It would restore soil carbon and restore ecosystems at the same time. It would restore the water supplies at the same time, because all that carbon holds onto the water. It'd be bottom up. It'd be all the farmers in the world would be the ones benefiting from that. And it's cheap and proven. That solution already exists and is shovel ready to implement. The down-to-earth solution is shovel-ready to implement, and we need a large-scale underground movement of people putting the carbon in the soil. As of now, it's not illegal to do so. It's not officially encouraged, because voluntarily, according to the Paris Agreement, anyone can do what they want if they want to put carbon in their soil. No one's going to pay them for it as of now. But the point is that those people who wish to do so voluntarily, the ones who are doing the right thing, need to be doing so on as large a scale as they can, and encouraging their neighbors who are doing the wrong thing to start doing the right thing. And we need to start actively putting pressure on governments to move away from big green towards real solutions, which is to have a carbon market that rewards the farmer and the person who restores the land, to move from degradation to restoration. Now, we've also got to recognize that so-called big green is not our green ally at all. They're our fraudulent friends. And really, they should be called big brown, because as a matter of fact, when you look inside closely at big green, it's the same old smelly brown stuff. What they've done is they've spray painted it with green wash. Green wash is perfumed and it's fluorescent day glow, bright glow. It makes it look beautiful. It makes the air smell beautiful, but it doesn't last. It washes right off and it's toxic as hell. So we need to avoid the fake solutions and move towards the real big green, which is geotherapy and soil carbon sequestration. And we only have about a decade to turn this around, so we better get started. So in view of the failure of governments in Paris to come to any solid agreement, and the fact that something has to be done, we're simply now, it's left to people to do it voluntarily at this point. There's no government mandate to actually solving the problem. We think it's crucial now that the year of the soil has ended. The irony is that 2015 was the year of the soil. And I was in Paris at the conference on World Soil Day on December 8th. I went to the FAO booth. FAO is a sponsor of World Soil Day and the Year of the Soil, and I looked for material on World Soil Day. At the UN Climate Change Conference, there was no information available on World Soil Day in the Year of the Soil that this either event ever happened, and there was no mention that it was in fact the solution to the climate change problem. Now, World Soil Day is over. The Year of the Soil is over. It's dead and it's buried. It's in the ground. It's underground. It's dead. At this point now, what we have to do is we have to regenerate it, recycle that carbon that was the remnants of that, and regenerate it into growing 10 times more. So what I'm proposing, what the Soil Carbon Alliance is proposing, is that now, following the Year of the Soil, we now enter the decade of soil carbon, the decade in which those people who know what it takes to increase soil carbon get to work, build a large underground movement, shovel-ready, and start increasing soil carbon wherever we can. We've got to get governments to go along, but the point is, the tools are ready. For instance, in our book on geotherapy, we discuss about half a dozen completely different methods that exist that farmers have developed to increase soil carbon, increase soil fertility in every habitat, in every continent except Antarctica. So the methods are known, and we now need to get to work because the solution is in hand. We just need to get to work, and we need to convince governments to do it on the scale that's needed to avert very serious disaster. Thank you.